All right. Well, hello. I'm Scott Stephenson. I'm the president and CEO of the Museum of the American Revolution. And I'm so excited to be able to spend some time today with my good friend, board member of the museum, Ray Halbritter. Hello, Ray. How are you doing today?
Seguli, Seguli. I'm
It's
good. Thank you.
fantastic to be able to get together with you, as always, of course. Um, Ray is the nation representative for the Oneida Indian Nation, as well as the CEO of the Oneida Nation Enterprises, which are the business ventures of the nation located in what most of us who would look on the map would recognize as central New York. But of course, the Oneida people living on their sovereign territory and part of their traditional homeland. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the kind of background and history of the nation, connection to the museum. We're going to get to some hot topics in the news, the renaming of the Washington football team, which I know is a topic that you've been super involved with for quite a long time, Ray. Talk a little bit about monuments, reflect on the moment we're in as a nation as we reflect on our history, on issues of diversity, and our path forward as we near the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence coming in 2026. So a very timely conversation.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Tell us a little background about you, Ray, for our viewers.
Well, as you said, I represent the Oneida Indian Nation. It's my honor and privilege to do so. And the nation, of course, has quite a significant role in the history of this country, going back, of course, to the Revolutionary War and even before, but the Revolutionary War sort of crystallized, if you will, in history, our relationship, our standing, if you will, with this, with the newly founded United States of America. And throughout our history, we've always had a special place in our own hearts for this country and for what we are today. And so today we are doing, through the years, we have lost some of our lands, and we suffered some loss of lands, and some of our culture has struggled. But today we're doing much better today, and we've regained a good deal of our lands, and we are now established on our homelands and making a better future, because for us, it's all about our children and their future.
Hmm. Yeah, I know here at the museum, we've been open, of course, just over 3 years. We've had just about 1 million visitors who've been through the museum. And, when I first joined the project in 2007, there had already been dialogue with the nation. I know you were a very early believer in the idea of the Oneida people story being told in what's essentially the nation's museum about its founding. And it's now, with this sort of test audience of 1 million people, I can say it is one of the most powerful experiences in the museum, to go into the Oneida Nation Theater, where we dramatically recreate this kind of dialogue, debate that had to happen in the nation in the midst of this civil war between colonists and the British.
Well, it's so fascinating to me because I see sort of so many parallels from what I read about history, what I've learned about history back during the time of the Revolutionary War, the discussion, the debates, the protests, the controversies. It's sort of, in a way, I see some of that in today's, reflects in today's context, where we have issues that are sort of similar about what history is. I mean, if the colonists had lost the Revolutionary War, they would have been all probably, as we know, hung as traitors or put in prison or who knows what. We would have been thrown in with them. But that was what we vowed, though. We vowed to enjoy the fruits of victory or be buried alongside the colonists in the same grave. I really admire how people express themselves in that age. It's a little sort of an older style, but yet very eloquent. And what I think was so striking to me about it is that the history, and as the museum itself has developed, it has been both inclusive and had a mission to try to bring a more accurate or full, if you will, complete picture. Not that what we knew before wasn't necessarily accurate. It was just that there was more to the story. And I just think it was, I think that's what's so effective and striking, that when you go in and it's so moving that you're seeing a more inclusive picture, you're seeing a more accurate one, and essentially the truth about our history.
Yeah, I think, one of the just things that's so powerful about seeing people who come to the museum and encounter this history. First of all, there's not a wide awareness, I think, in the American, general population just about Native American history, the fact that Native people are still present among us. Traditionally, history is told by others in natural history museums, right? Not history museums. I mean, that's growing up as a child in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I was fascinated by Native American culture, but going to the Carnegie Museum of History and seeing the past represented. But I very distinctly remember as a child on a family trip up through what's now Western New York, and seeing one of those brochures in a rack for the Seneca Indian Nation's museum up in Salamanca, and photographs of Native people. It's like the first time, me as a young white child in Pennsylvania realized, wait, there are American Indians still around. And that's, as you know, in the museum, at the end of that theatrical presentation, we show a series of photographs of Oneida people since the age of photography, Civil War veterans, Spanish American War, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, to present day, to show that passage time. And I mean, visitors of all ages have tears in their eyes as they grapple with that story. So we're just so grateful for our partnership with you and for the nation to be able to tell this story and expose so many people to it.
Well, I think that is part of what makes a museum like the Museum of the American Revolution so relevant in this day and age. We sometimes think of museums as sort of archaic places where you just sort of look at old things, but this is so relevant. What's happening with the museum, what happened and what they display is part of not only what happened, but what is happening even currently. Because when we ask the questions about some of the issues of the day, whether they're monuments, whether the name of Mascot issues, that history and where it came from and what it means is so important, because so many people don't know the full side of the story. Why is that an issue? Why is it an issue, this particular monument, or the way this story is told? And museums are critically important to be able to tell the whole story, because where this begins is with our youth in our schools. And as we're young, what do we learn? And in this particular case, what we never learned. So to me, it's both enlightening, but sometimes when you see something that you've never heard, it's almost like it dropped out of the sky. Is this a fiction? Are you kidding me? I never heard that. Sometimes it's hard to believe some of the history, but that's what makes the museum so relevant, but also so fascinating when you understand it in the context of today and our lives that we have today.
Oh, fabulous. Well, we're so grateful for your many years of involvement with the museum and obviously support. So I'd love to, you alluded to things in the news now, and I'd love to talk, because many people, particularly sports fans, are reading about the change in the name of Washington's NFL football team. And this is a topic you've got above average involvement and interest in. So I'd love to hear about, your background and the road that you've been on, and maybe some reflection on how you're feeling.
Well, it's a bit of a story, I'll tell you, but it starts, of course, the Oneida Nation, as we've just been talking about, was part of the Revolutionary War. President George Washington, at the time, General George Washington, we had a relationship with George Washington, and also the Marquis de Lafayette. That's part of the story, but for another time possibly. So we have a special relationship with Washington and the city that bears its name, the capital. But the way we got more involved in this issue about the Washington team name was because Cooperstown High School, which hosts the Baseball Hall of Fame, is not very far from here, and they had some students who we heard had the same name and wanted to change the name because it was they were convinced that they needed to change the name because of what it meant. For people who don't know, the term comes from a time when there was actual bounties for the scalps of Indians to prove that you killed an Indian. So their lives, there was a bounty on their lives. So that's why it was so, in the skin itself was blood red. And so you showed that red skin to show that you killed an Indian. So it's very, has a deeper effect on our lives. But we were so inspired by these kids at this high school, and I went out to see them. They wanted to change the name. They didn't have the money to afford the change in uniforms because it would have required new uniforms. So we donated the money to do that. But those young kids were so inspirational because that's our future. We look at the children. Our people have a way of saying that what we have today is only borrowed from our children's future. So we know that it gave us such hope in the future that this new generation, those are going to be our new leaders, our new people, they're going to be our new congressional leaders, judges, presidents, that it gave us just such hope that change is possible, that they gave and inspired us so much that we decided to begin to change the Mascot campaign. We drew in civil rights groups, religious leaders, public health organizations, athletes, elected officials, and discussed with them, and they understood why the team's name was such a problem. And it really, social sciences showed how it hurts the self-esteem of American Indian youth. It actually does cause, it's not a harmless name, it's not a harmless way of speaking. And we have one of the highest teen suicide rates in the world, among other things, among other problems. But a lot of people, of course, just didn't understand it. So fans obviously didn't understand it. And that's part of what the conversation, what occurs. And oftentimes, as we know, like the American Revolution, opinions can create reactions, and protests can create reactions, and that can create actions. And those reactions, there's actions, and sometimes those are very troublesome, but sometimes that is what has to happen for change to take place. So we know that this was not always going to be understood by people. Why would you talk about a name that affects especially a sports team? The NFL is a major cultural phenomenon. It's so powerful in our culture. Why would you want to inject yourself where everybody's happy? Can't you just go have a good time like everybody else? Well, yes, we would. But the words mean things. Words are powerful and can be powerful and very effective. So this was our involvement in the name change and why we began our efforts to cause the name to change. Unfortunately, now the name is changed and is now currently known as the Washington football team, and as they seek a new name and mascot.
Well, congratulations on that cause.
Well, it's to us all. A lot of people have been involved in that.
And I did not know the beginning of that story began with actions from young people, from students.
And it's amazing. That's our future, our young people.
Now, of course, more broadly, and we've had conversations at the museum here about and panel discussions with invited guests and yourself about the sort of struggle we have with how to remember historical figures, balance between remembrance and commemoration and celebration. Many kinds of monuments are on the discussion block right now. Ironically, as you know, the museum, we do a lot with tearing down a very famous statue of King George III that, of course, happened in New York in 1776. And that's been an interesting opportunity, actually beginning in 2017, our first year of opening, with the march in Charlottesville and the controversy over Confederate statues. a great example of how a museum, is not just about an archaic experience of the past, but as a platform for discussions about past, present, and future. And I'm just curious, what your thoughts are here in Philadelphia, where I'm sitting. A very famous statue of Christopher Columbus is about to be relocated by the city, and its future location, under very passionate discussion about many communities here in Philadelphia. And what observations, guidance, suggestions, wisdom can you share on this?
Well, I'd like to be a person who can give overall wonderful wisdom in all of this, but I can tell you that in my opinion, there is a very important difference between commemoration and celebration of history in the form of monuments or statues. Mm-hmm. Commemorating involves getting input from the affected individuals so that everyone is sort of sharing in what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Celebrations are really is to support what we want, what our feelings are on a subject or an issue. Mm-hmm. And when you're talking about, for example, in the Washington team's name, it was given to the team by George Preston Marshall, who was the owner, but he was an avowed segregationist. And his monument was near the monument where the team was played, and that monument was taken down as the issues of the country were as a consequence of the George Floyd killing and the resultant actions by many people in many cities to the systemic racist issues and probably what happens is that some people, again, don't realize what is happening and what is going on to a particular group of people because it doesn't necessarily affect them. They don't really feel something from it. Whereas the affected people do feel something, and they do feel they need to do something. And this is what happened. They needed to say and do something to bring attention to the government that takes care of the policing, that takes care of the school systems, the colleges, the governments that they have to, this society that we live in. So the George Preston Marshall situation, it was not honoring anyone except the owner himself and maybe some people who unknowingly were supporting that. So he chose language that was really disparaging in the name of the team. Mm-hmm. So the team recognized his role and how that was not something to be commemorated. And they took down his statue a few weeks before officially retiring the name. So, whenever anyone is going to deal with someone, especially they're going to want to commemorate them, or it's always good that they discuss, especially when they're invoking a culture in an appropriate way that isn't their own. It's important for them to consult the actual owners, if you will, of that culture. At a minimum, the people are impacted by that culture and who carry and live with it every day and get their input from those decisions. Not, the Seminoles, the Florida State Seminoles talked to the Seminole Nation. The Seminoles were sensitive about it, but they came to an understanding, so that worked out. Now, not always is that a simple way to solve, like that's just the solution, but that certainly is important, I think, when you're dealing with an issue, because some monuments are celebrating one version of history. And sometimes it's an inaccurate version, and sometimes it's just not the full version of the history. And people who are on the other side of the issue are going to want to make sure that at a minimum that their story is told. I went to the Battle of the Little Bighorn out west, and it was really, we all know about the Battle of the Little Bighorn and George Armstrong Custer and his group, 7th Cavalry, and they were defeated. And they had a monument both to what had happened with him and his soldiers, and they allowed for a monument on the native, if you will, the native leaders and people who were involved in the battle too. So you saw both sides of the battle, because we all inhabit this country, and American Indians were here, and they view, of course, a battle like that as a victory, while someone else is going to view it as a loss or massacre. So these are parts of the discussion that certainly, I think, can take place, and I think will help with dealing with such issues like this. And certainly that kind of discussion is so critical. And I think the museum has just is finding itself plunged in the middle of these issues, because this is so topical today, so important for today. And today is going to be our tomorrow's history. So this is critical for and important to all of us.
Absolutely. No, and I think, you know, your story of the sort of the origins of the Washington football team's name and its connection to segregation and, you know, an earlier time in American history, I think points to the interconnectedness of civil rights movements for many different kinds of people and communities in America. And sometimes we separate communities out and don't acknowledge the degree to which actions by a group inspire another group, and that there's a lot of feedback that happens that hopefully bends toward justice in the long term.
Yeah, I would say that the idea of changing, if you will, the way monuments are presented doesn't mean you eradicate them. I'm not talking about eradicating and ignoring that. No, they're an important part. I think part of it is just the way you discuss them and display them. I think some of as I mentioned, some of the monuments, you know, sort of establish one version of history. If it's a Confederate statue, it's sort of celebrating, if you will, one side of history. The Civil War was fought from the South, will say states' rights, but some will say it's because of the superior. They had to show the superiority. It was an issue of superiority of one race over another. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, for African Americans, it's an important issue and one that's very sensitive to them, because they have, you know, that's where they came from. They were brought here in a forced fashion. Slavery was a horrible stigma on the ideals of our country. It was fortunately changed. This country, that's one beautiful thing about this country. It evolves, it changes, it fixes things. And this is one of those things it fixed. But it's still one version of history is slavery, and one race's idea of proving or demonstrating or achieving a dominance over another race, which is not one of the ideals of the country. So that's one version. So a fuller version, and one that, you know, those statues could be in a museum. It could be where they're in a position or an environment that can explain the context. So I think there, you know, maybe not everyone's going to agree, but I think there is a way to have this done in a way that people can be more included and less offended, if you will. And so, you know, people sometimes over-exaggerate political correctness or the statement of that. And some people don't realize it's not about political correctness. It's about historical correctness in many cases. Mm-hmm. And that really ultimately is the truth of things. And so I think for some people, it's not so much that you want to eradicate history. You just want the truth of history to be told.
A bigger, fuller, often messier version.
I'm old enough to know who Paul Harvey was, and he used to always say, and here's the rest of the story. And so he would give the rest of the story.
I'm old enough too. Oh, gosh. Well, and I know just before we started recording, we were, I think, referring back to that era, reflecting on the passing of John Lewis. And I know you said this had been on your mind quite a bit. I'm just curious if there's any thoughts it's inspired that you think, you know, by way of concluding our time together, that, you know, might be worthy.
Well, I never had the privilege or honor of meeting Mr. Lewis. But I did hear and listen to much of the eulogy and the statements of people who did know him. I certainly know him by his efforts in the racial inequality and issues of government, the voting rights bill. He was instrumental in helping get passed, and succeeding presidents sign those into law, both Republican and Democrat. He certainly lived an incredibly controversial life early on, as before the Freedom Riders even began, he and another gentleman I learned started getting on a bus, refusing to go sit in a segregated section of the bus in public transportation, and not knowing what was going to happen to himself. And I think that what bravery and courage, I wasn't aware of. I mean, he had been beaten numerous times. I saw one very fascinating story about the incredible kindness and goodness in this man by one of the Ku Klux Klan members who actually beat him up at one of the events he was at. He was at many. Later changed his life and met him and apologized to Congressman Lewis about what he had done, and Lewis graciously accepted his apology. And this is happening in our lifetime. This is not something you read about, which but this is why history is so critically important. But certainly what John Lewis did and many of his people and followers did was something that was controversial. His protests were often violent. He was met with violence. He was beaten. His skull was fractured. He nonetheless picked himself up and kept moving forward. And he would talk in terms of good trouble. It's okay to have good trouble, which is standing up for the right, which is doing what is right to make the right changes in this country. Now we're a little bit afield of the native, but I got to tell you, we identify with the struggle. Our people wanted change too, not unlike the change in the Washington team name, which wasn't quite as confrontational. But it was so moving to hear the personal stories of people who knew Congressman Lewis and what he had experienced, what his goals in life were. It was very striking and very moving to me.
Indeed. Well, Ray, if in addition to visiting the Museum of the American Revolution, if viewers are interested in learning more about the Oneida Nation, not just in the past, but with all the amazing endeavors that are going on today, what are some good ways to get more involved and to learn more about your people?
Well, we're still here. We've been here since time immemorial. You can find us on the website. We are the Oneidas. Oneidas did split in the 1800s to differ. There was a community in Wisconsin and one in Canada. We are the Oneidas who stubbornly refused to move from our home. And we have now have some business enterprises, and people are welcome to come and visit. We're off exit 33 of the New York State Thruway.
Turning Stone, right?
Turning Stone. We have a cultural center. We have Turning Stone Resort. And we invite everyone, certainly is welcome. As is our cultural custom, we consider ourselves allies of this country, the oldest allies of the United States of America. We're very proud of that. And we very much enjoy people coming to learn more about who we are as a people, and we're always delighted we'll make you feel right at home.
Fantastic. Well, I'm so grateful for you taking the time to sit with me today, and I'll look forward to seeing you at the next board meeting.
Well, I got to tell you, Professor Stephenson, you've done a wonderful job with the museum, and it's a privilege and an honor to be part of this. And we're so proud of what you've done and to be part of this and the incredible work you're doing. And it's what's so amazing is how important what this is. It's not just showing and displaying history. It really is a part of what we were and what we are today, what we're going to be tomorrow. Thank you for your good work.
Oh, thank you. Be well.
You too. Be safe.